In 1876, train travel meant starvation between stops. Passengers gnawed stale railroad pie and drank coffee as bitter as wormwood, served by men who reused the same plate for the next batch off the train. Then, a British immigrant named Fred Harvey put white linen and real china in a desert depot and changed how America ate. Number 14 on this list was a favorite of a future president. Number 3 was so generous it embarrassed the competition. And number 1 was hauled across hundreds of miles of poisoned desert water just so it could taste right. These 25 dishes were served by the famous Harvey girls in 25 minutes flat, then vanished when the highways came. Hit subscribe. Let us count down. Number 25. Fresh baked bread and feather rolls. Before the train ever whistled in, the smell hit you. Every Harvey house baked its own bread on site, sometimes hundreds of loaves and rolls a day, because Fred Harvey would not serve a traveler day-old anything. The dinner rolls came to the table hot, pulled apart in a cloud of steam, with cold, curled butter on a chilled plate beside them. A Harvey girl set them down without you asking, because anticipating your needs was the entire job. In a country where trackside food was often a heavy biscuit you could throw through a window, this was a small miracle. The bread alone told you that you had walked into a different kind of place, that someone here actually cared whether you ate well before you climbed back onto a swaying car for another 300 miles. Number 24, flannel cakes. These were not the thick flapjacks you picture. Harvey's flannel cakes were made with a yeast batter, 1 pound of flour, a quart of water, a small yeast cake set to rise overnight, then worked with beaten eggs, melted butter, and a little maple syrup. Cooked thin on a screaming hot griddle iron, they came out so light and delicate that they earned their name. They felt like flannel on the tongue. A stack arrived golden and lacy, with real maple syrup, and a pat of butter sliding down the side. Travelers who had been eating salt pork and hardtack for days wept a little over these. They cost pennies to make, but they tasted like civilization. The yeast is what modern cooks skip, reaching for baking powder instead, and that single shortcut is why nothing on a diner griddle today tastes quite like what the Harvey girls carried out at 6 in the morning. Number 23, rice griddle cakes. When the cook had leftover boiled rice, none of it went to waste. He worked half a cup of cold, cooked rice into the pancake batter with his fingertips, then added milk, a beaten egg, and melted butter, then dropped the mixture by the spoonful onto the griddle. The rice gave the cakes a tender, almost creamy center, and tiny, chewy bits that made them more interesting than any plain pancake. By the time the last one went down, the first was already puffed, bubbling, and ready to flip. It was thrift, dressed up as luxury, which was the secret of the whole operation. The cook stretched yesterday's rice into this morning's breakfast, and the passenger had no idea he was eating leftovers. He just knew it was the best breakfast he had eaten since leaving home, somewhere 1,000 miles back east. Number 22, Harvey French toast. This was no soggy slab. Harvey's French toast became so legendary that decades later, the great American food writer James Beard made a point of recreating it himself. Thick-cut house bread was soaked in a rich custard of eggs and cream, then fried in butter until the outside turned crisp and lacquered gold, while the inside stayed soft as pudding. Dusted with powdered sugar and served with syrup, it ate more like dessert than breakfast. The difference was the bread, baked that morning, and the patience to let it drink the custard all the way through instead of just wetting the surface. A traveler stepping off a dusty platform at dawn could have a plate of this in front of him in 3 minutes flat. That was the genius of the place. Restaurant-quality food at depot speed before the locomotive had even finished taking on water. Number 21, calf's liver and bacon. Today, people wrinkle their noses at liver, but in the Harvey dining room, it was a proper supper for a working man. The liver was sliced thin, dredged lightly in seasoned flour, and laid into a hot skillet for barely 2 minutes aside, just long enough to brown the outside while leaving the center faintly pink and tender. Cook it longer and it turned to shoe leather, which is exactly how a whole generation learned to hate it elsewhere. Done the Harvey way, it was mild, rich, and almost sweet, piled with bacon and a heap of onions cooked down soft and golden in the drippings. It was cheap, it was nourishing, and it delivered a punch of iron that kept rail crews and cowboys upright through brutal days. The cooks knew the timing by instinct. That instinct is the thing we lost. Number 20, mountain trout. Out west, the Harvey houses served fresh trout pulled from cold streams, and the chefs prepared it with a detail that would horrify a modern health inspector. The original instruction was to clean the fish, but leave the head, the tail, and the natural slime on the skin, because that coating carried the flavor. The trout was poached gently in a court bouillon of fish stock, onion, bay leaf, cloves, vinegar, and lemon, then served whole, often finished with butter and toasted almonds. The flesh came away from the bone in pale, sweet flakes. For a traveler crossing a continent of salt pork and beans, a delicate poached trout on good china was an almost unimaginable luxury. It tasted of clean water and cold mountains. It told you that the West was not just dust and danger, that there was something beautiful out here worth crossing the desert for. First pattern break. Here is the part the movies never explain. You only had about 25 minutes. The train stopped to take on water and coal, and that was your window. So Fred Harvey built a machine out of human beings. As the train approached, a conductor wired ahead exactly how many passengers wanted the full meal and how many wanted the lunch counter. The kitchen was already cooking. When you sat down, a Harvey girl took your drink order using a silent code with the cups. A cup turned right side up meant coffee. A cup upside down meant hot tea. Upside down and tilted against the saucer meant iced tea. Tilted the other way meant milk. A second girl, the drink girl, read those cups and filled them before the first girl finished the table. No words. By the time you sat, your soup was nearly there. You ate a 4-course meal and made your train. It was an assembly line of hospitality, 50 years before fast food pretended to invent the idea. Number 19, oysters en brochette. Yes, oysters in the middle of the New Mexico desert. The Harvey cooks dried large oysters, seasoned them with salt and cayenne, wrapped each one in a strip of parboiled bacon, secured it with a toothpick, then dipped the whole thing in flour, egg wash, and fresh breadcrumbs. Threaded onto skewers and fried in hot lard until golden, they came to the table on toast points with lemon wedges and parsley. You bit through the crisp shell into the smoky bacon and the briny burst of the oyster underneath. Travelers could not believe they were eating fresh seafood hundreds of miles from any ocean. That was exactly the impression Harvey wanted to make. He was selling the impossible, and he delivered it on a plate, hot every single day, while the locomotive hissed outside the window. Number 18, Blue Point oysters and little neck clams on ice. For the grandest meals, especially aboard the dining cars of the California Limited, Harvey served Blue Point oysters on the half shell and little neck clams over crushed ice. Raw, cold, glistening, with lemon and a dab of horseradish, they opened a fine dinner the way the finest restaurants in New York or San Francisco would. To a rancher or a homesteader who had spent the season eating beans out of a tin cup, the sight of a silver tray of raw oysters in the middle of the prairie was almost unbelievable. The clams snapped with sweetness. The oysters tasted of the distant sea. Harvey was not just feeding people, he was performing a kind of magic, proving that the West had been tamed enough to deliver the same elegance the East took for granted, all of it riding the rails on ice. Number 17, Bullfrog Sauté Provençal. The Harvey chefs, many of them trained in France, were not shy about ambition. Frog legs, sautéed in butter with garlic, shallots, onion, fresh mushrooms, and diced tomatoes, finished with parsley and olives and served from a chafing dish, appeared on Harvey menus as a genuine delicacy. The meat was mild and tender, somewhere between chicken and fish, soaking up all that garlicky butter. Eastern travelers who fancied themselves sophisticated were delighted to find a dish in the middle of the frontier that they would have expected only in the dining rooms of Paris. It was a flex, plain and simple. Fred Harvey wanted the wealthy passenger to understand that stepping off the train into a dusty western town did not mean stepping down in the world. If anything, the food was better than what they had left behind in the city. Number 16, prairie chicken and quail. Harvey believed in local food long before anyone called it that. Local hunters and producers supplied the houses with prairie chickens, which are a kind of grouse, along with quail and other wild game from the surrounding plains. The birds were roasted or pan-fried and served with rich gravies, often on toast to catch every drop. The meat was darker and more flavorful than barnyard chicken, with a faint wildness that spoke of the open grassland just outside the window. It was a taste of the actual place you were traveling through, not some imported idea of fine dining. Harvey's own farms supplied the milk, butter, and eggs, and refrigerated boxcars hauled in the rest. But the game on your plate had been running across that prairie days earlier. You were eating the West itself, plated beautifully and served by a girl in a spotless white apron. Number 15, Harvey cheese soup. This was the dish that a future president could not get enough of. A favorite of Harry Truman's, first at the St. Louis Union Station House and later in Kansas City. It was a thick, velvety soup built on beef broth and grated sharp cheddar, smoothed with a butter roux, then enriched with light cream, a hit of Worcestershire, and white pepper. Simmered slowly until silky and served with warm toasted crackers crumbled on top, it was pure comfort in a bowl, the kind of thing that made a tired traveler close his eyes on the first spoonful. It was rich enough to be a meal and humble enough that anyone could love it. Truman certainly did, ordering it for years across 2 different stations. When the man who would run the country had a regular order at your lunch counter, you know the cooks are doing something right. Number 14, red snapper a la Creole. On the famous meals by Fred Harvey dining cars, red snapper came dressed in a Creole sauce, peppers and onions and tomatoes, stewed down with spice until they hugged the fish in something bright and savory. It was a nod to New Orleans, where Fred Harvey himself had worked as a young man, and it carried that same bold Gulf Coast soul. The snapper stayed moist under the sauce, flaking into clean white pieces shot through with the warmth of the peppers. Alongside it on those same menus, you might find roast squab, prime roast beef au jus, and pistachio ice cream, a spread that would not embarrass a city hotel. And remember, this was rolling across the desert at 40 miles an hour. The kitchen was the size of a closet. The fact that any of it reached the table at all, let alone tasted this good, was a small daily wonder. Second pattern break. Here is what almost no one knows. Fred Harvey built a French restaurant empire in the American desert on purpose. He hired chefs from Europe and trained his kitchens in the techniques of Auguste Escoffier, the man who basically invented modern fine dining. That is why the food tasted the way it did. These were not short-order cooks. They were classically trained professionals working in train depots, and the supply chain behind them was staggering for the time. Twice a week, special refrigerated boxcars carried California fruit, vegetables, and fresh seafood east to the kitchens, then carried Kansas City beef west on the return trip. Because the alkali in western water was so foul it would ruin coffee and sicken passengers, the Santa Fe hauled clean drinking water by rail to every single house. Harvey spent money most businessmen would have called insane. He understood something they did not. People will never forget how you made them feel at the table. Number 13, prime rib au jus. The beef was a point of pride because much of it came from Fred Harvey's own ranches. The prime rib was roasted slow until a dark, seasoned crust formed over a rosy, tender interior, then carved thick and served swimming in its own natural juices, the au jus. There was no disguising cheap meat here, no heavy sauce hiding a tough cut. This was the real thing, the kind of roast that a working family might see only at Christmas, available to you in a railroad depot for the price of a regular dinner. The choicest cuts were reserved for the dining cars and the grand hotels. You cut into it, and the knife went through like butter. For a traveler used to the gristle and gravy of trackside stew, that first bite of properly aged, properly roasted beef was something he would describe to his grandchildren. Number 12, tenderloin steak and French fries. The standard. Harvey dinner, 60 cents in the early years and climbing to $1 by 1918, often centered on a tenderloin or sirloin steak with a pile of crisp French fries, broccoli, hot rolls, and coffee or tea. For 60 cents, in a country where a good restaurant meal could cost far more, you got a multi-course dinner cooked by a trained chef and served on imported china. The steak was thick and properly seared. The fries were fried fresh, not sitting under a lamp. The whole plate was a deliberate bargain, because Harvey knew that fair value built loyalty, and loyalty filled his houses for decades. Instead, he kept the price low and the quality absurdly high. And in doing so, he taught an entire nation what a restaurant was supposed to be. Number 11, roast squab. Squab, which is young pigeon, was a genuine fine dining centerpiece in the Harvey kitchens, the kind of bird you would find at the most expensive tables in the great cities. Roasted until the skin turned crisp and mahogany, and the dark meat stayed juicy underneath, it was small, rich, and elegant, often served whole so the diner could see exactly what he was getting. It was the sort of dish that announced an occasion. A man treating his family on a long journey, a couple celebrating, a businessman closing a deal, would order the squab and feel like royalty doing it. That a frontier depot could put a perfectly roasted squab in front of you in the same 25 minutes it took the train to take on water says everything about the standard Fred Harvey refused to lower, no matter how far from the city his houses stood. Number 10, baby turkey a l'albufera. This is where the kitchen showed off. A whole baby turkey was singed, cleaned, and stuffed with risotto studded with diced truffles, then poached slowly in stock with vegetables and a bouquet garni until tender. It was finished with albufera sauce, a luxurious supreme sauce reduced from the bird's own broth and enriched with meat extract and sweet butter, then garnished with little pastry shells filled with mushrooms and truffles. This was Escoffier-level haute cuisine, the kind of dish served at state dinners, appearing on a holiday menu in a railroad town. Truffles, in the desert. The travelers who ordered it on Thanksgiving had likely never tasted anything like it, and never would again, unless they came back to a Harvey house. That was the point. Harvey did not want to match the competition. There was no competition. He wanted you to remember this meal for the rest of your life. Number 9, Bright Angel Mexican Salisbury Steak. At the Bright Angel Lodge on the rim of the Grand Canyon, the Harvey chefs gave the humble Salisbury steak a southwestern soul. Lean ground beef was mixed with diced pimento, plenty of green chile, onion, breadcrumbs, and egg, formed into patties, browned, and then smothered in a red chili sauce. It took a cheap cut of meat and turned it into something with real fire and character, the green chile bringing a brightness and heat that plain beef never had. This was Harvey doing what he did best, honoring the food of the actual region instead of pretending he was still in New York. A traveler standing at the edge of the greatest canyon on earth could sit down to a dish that tasted unmistakably of the Southwest. The place and the plate matched. Few restaurants then, or now, bother to make that connection so completely. Number 8, La Fonda chicken with red chili and almonds. At La Fonda in Santa Fe, the chef created a chicken dish so good it went out nationwide on the Associated Press wire, recommended to housewives as a meal to warm a fall-chilled throat and the cockles of the heart. The chicken was salted, rolled in a mixture of chili powder and flour, and roasted until brown, then dusted with more chili, garlic, and a teaspoon of cumin seed before slow roasting in stock for 3.5 hours. The gravy was finished with a 1/4 pound of melted butter poured over the bird, and the whole thing was showered with toasted almonds. It was deeply spiced, rich, and unlike anything in the standard American cookbook. This was the Harvey Company doing something quietly radical. It was treating the regional Hispanic and native cooking of New Mexico as cuisine worthy of a national audience decades before the rest of the country caught up. Third pattern break. Here is the secret ingredient that modern chefs are only now rediscovering, and it is not an ingredient at all. It is respect for local food. While the rest of America was busy flattening everything into bland sameness, the Fred Harvey Company was preserving and elevating the cooking of the Southwest. Green chile, red chile, cumin, the dishes of New Mexico, and the vaquero borderlands. Harvey put these on white tablecloth menus and served them to wealthy tourists from Chicago and Boston. He hired native artists and sold their work. He helped turn the Grand Canyon and Santa Fe into destinations. Today, every farm-to-table restaurant bragging about local sourcing and regional heritage is doing, on a smaller scale, exactly what Fred Harvey did a century ago. He understood that the food of a place is the soul of a place. We are still catching up to a railroad caterer who figured it out in the 1880s. Number 7. Empanadas with hot vanilla sauce. At La Fonda, the chefs made dessert empanadas, pastry turnovers filled with a mixture of finely chopped cooked beef, mincemeat, suet, oregano, sugar, and grated lemon peel. The edges were fluted, the tops pricked to vent steam, and the whole thing was fried in deep hot fat until crisp and golden. Then came the part that made it unforgettable. They were served with a hot vanilla sauce, a silky pour of butter, cornstarch, sugar, boiling water, and real vanilla. The contrast of the savory, sweet-spiced filling against the warm vanilla cream was the kind of thing you would expect from a sophisticated pastry chef, not a depot kitchen. It blurred the line between dinner and dessert in the best possible way. Travelers remembered these for years. It was comfort and surprise on the same plate, and it sent you back to the train with something sweet to think about across the long miles ahead. Number 6. Apricot honey custard. From an original Harvey recipe box of more than 200 cards comes a custard that sounds almost too simple to be special. 4 eggs were lightly beaten with a teaspoon of salt, a cup of apricot nectar, and a couple of tablespoons of strained honey, then baked gently into a smooth, trembling custard. The apricot gave it a soft golden color and a tart, sweet brightness, while the honey rounded everything into something mellow and floral. It was the kind of light, elegant finish the Harvey kitchens excelled at, a dessert that did not sit heavy after a big meal. Custards like this turned up across the houses because they were cheap to make, used the eggs and dairy from Harvey's own farms, and tasted refined far beyond their cost. It is exactly the sort of quiet, lovely dish that vanishes from a culture when convenience takes over, replaced by something from a packet that only pretends to be custard. Number 5. Pistachio ice cream. On the dining cars of the California Limited, dinner ended with pistachio ice cream, pale green, cold, and studded with real nuts. Picture it. You are crossing a blazing desert in a wooden rail car in 1900. There is no refrigeration as we know it, and a Harvey girl sets down a dish of freshly made ice cream in front of you. The cold alone felt like a miracle. The flavor, nutty and sweet and smooth, was a final flourish on a meal that had no business being this good in the middle of nowhere. Ice cream on a moving train across the American desert was the kind of impossible luxury that built the Harvey legend. It was Fred Harvey saying, in the language of dessert, that no journey was too rough and no place too remote to deserve something beautiful at the end of supper. Number 4. Welsh rarebit. This British-born dish combined sharp cheddar melted with ale or beer, mustard and Worcestershire into a thick, savory sauce poured bubbling over toast. It was a Harvey favorite that suited the chain's English roots perfectly. Fred Harvey, after all, was a Liverpool boy who never lost his accent. The rarebit came to the table hot and glossy, the toast underneath soft at the edges and crisp in the middle, the cheese sauce tangy and rich. It made a satisfying light supper or a hearty snack for a traveler who did not want a full dinner before sleeping in a swaying berth. It was humble, fast, and deeply comforting, the savory cousin of the cheese soup that a president loved. Today, most Americans have never even heard of it, but for decades it was a reliable, beloved fixture, the kind of warm and simple thing the Harvey houses understood was just as important as the truffles and squab. Number 3, the Harvey pie. Here is the dish so generous it became a legend. Fred Harvey had a rule about pie. Where every other restaurant in America cut a pie into 6 or even 8 thin slices to squeeze out more sales, Harvey cut his pies into quarters, 4 enormous wedges, a quarter of a whole pie for the same price others charged for a sliver. The story goes that a manager once tried to cut the pies smaller to save money, and Harvey overruled him on the spot, insisting that no one would ever leave his table feeling cheated over a piece of pie. The pies themselves, apple, cherry, custard, lemon, were baked fresh in the house every day. That oversized wedge became a signature, a symbol of the whole Harvey philosophy. Give people more than they expect. Modern restaurants obsessed with portion control and margins have forgotten this completely. Fred Harvey knew that generosity, served on a plate, is the cheapest advertising money can buy. Number 2, the Super Chief Dining Car Feast. By the 1930s, the Fred Harvey name rode the most glamorous train in America, the Super Chief, the train of the stars that carried Hollywood between Los Angeles and Chicago. Mary Coulter designed a special china pattern called membrano, based on ancient Native American pottery, just for these cars. On it, Harvey served caviar, charlotte russe, fresh seafood, and elaborate multi-course dinners to movie stars and millionaires racing across the desert at speed. This was the absolute peak of American rail dining, the most luxurious meal the country could offer outside its grandest hotels, served on hand-designed china to the most famous faces in the world. It represented everything Fred Harvey had been building toward since that first 20-seat lunchroom in Topeka. From feeding hungry settlers a hot biscuit to plating caviar for Hollywood royalty, the Harvey Company had carried fine dining clear across a continent that 60 years earlier had nothing but rancid stew. Number 1, the coffee. Of everything Fred Harvey served, the coffee was sacred. He was obsessive about it. The coffee had to be fresh, brewed in small batches, and thrown out after 2 hours, no matter what. It was never reheated, never bitter, and never the wormwood sludge that defined trackside dining everywhere else. Because the alkali water of the West would ruin it, Harvey had the railroad haul clean water hundreds of miles by tank car to every single house, just so the coffee would taste right. A traveler could get a fresh, hot, perfect cup of coffee in the middle of the desert, refilled silently the instant the cup ran low. It was the first thing many passengers tasted when they stepped off the train, and the last thing they had before they climbed back on. More than the truffles, more than the squab, that simple, honest, perfect cup of coffee was the promise of the whole Harvey system, that out here in the rough and dusty West, someone had decided you were worth doing right. That is the forgotten world the Harvey girls carried out on trays, 25 minutes at a time. Which of these would you order if your train pulled in tonight? Tell me in the comments, and tell me if your family ever rode the Santa Fe or knew a Harvey girl, because those stories are vanishing as fast as the recipes did.